So it's time to pick out your next cosplay. Here's a character who you absolutely love, however you feel like you could amplify the design a little more. Along with the design application, you get to utilize a ton of new skills to add to your repertoire. Ladies and gentlemen, I present to you What is cosplay amplification? Amplification is when you upgrade a pre-existing design using various materials and techniques. A way to figure out what you can amplify is by looking at the different techniques you can use for a specific costume. Doing this, I was able to learn a ton of new skills. I learned millinery, hand embroidery, leatherwork, and couture tailoring methods. However, to make my cosplay totally unique, I used inspiration from other mediums. I collected various images in a Pinterest board, and there's one particular that inspired me. Touch grass. I can't. I eat it all. Yeah, that looks like something you do. Alright, so I've gotten myself a good amount of references, not to mention a lot of design inspiration. A lot of these will work really well, and... Hold up. Cute goth boys. Tailored military uniforms. And not just that. Slightly questionable, I'll stop. With my inspiration in mind, it was time for me to pick out materials. As you can see, fabric and texture can be a really amazing way to amplify the design. Since I wanted to go for an edgy visual K feel, I felt like the mixture of these pleathers would look really good together. Not to mention, it keeps with the gothic, spooky vibe of Gordon. I also ended up using a black velvet for the cape, as the black really looked nice against the gray, since it gave it more contrast, and I ended up lining it with a silk satin. Since this was a competition build, I obviously had to keep the design accurate to the original character, however, I could always add details. Again, taking inspiration from the visual K element, I ended up adding a chain around the hat. I also expressed new forms of embroidery and wasn't afraid to add decorative stitching to give them a slightly voodoo feel. You'll see in my creation process the other details such as leather details and beading details that I added. Amplification can also come in clever props. When I first saw Gordon's doll collection, I knew I had to make them. Obviously, there are infinite ways to amplify your costume. You can use various painting techniques and finishes, LEDs, and try new things with makeup. Especially in the props department. Since Black Clover is a fantasy anime, you can really interpret their different magic and abilities in ways that could be really unique to a cosplay. Even drones can be utilized! Beginning with the fabrics. I'm starting off with this black cotton that I'll use for my lining and mock-up. To get the best fit possible, I actually use a t-shirt that I trace out onto my fabric as a base. I'll make a quick animation to show you what the full pattern looks like. But essentially, I take my base and draw on all the seams that I want. While I always have to think about seam allowance, this is a really good way for drafting patterns, especially for uniform or uniform-like garments. Once I was happy with my mock-up, I traced it onto my fashion fabric. As you can see, the fabric I'm using is a faux reptile upholstery. Surprisingly, finding the right color fabric was a bit of a challenge, and while I wasn't quite sure when I first saw the fabric, when I thought about how I wanted to add a visual K inspiration, I realized that the fabric would be perfect. I also created the pants from scratch. I just took a pair of pants that had the right fit and traced them onto my fabric. While they may be hard to see in the reference, there's actually a lot of pockets on this outfit. All of them are functional. As you can see, I'm just drawing out a square, adding the lines where I want the decorative seams, and then adding seam allowance. I did the same with my cotton lining I used earlier. This way all my pockets are lined. Once I constructed and added my pockets, I went over everything with a damp paper towel to get rid of all the chalk. Now it's time to construct my lining. I used an iron-on stiffener which I added to each of the pieces. And while this may seem like a bit much considering the fabric is already very stiff as it is, I ran into an issue where the weight of the fabric around the chest would cause it to collapse in on itself. So I started by adding an iron-on stiffener. This worked great for the collars and the back, however I needed a little bit more when it came to the chest area, which you'll see. For now, I'm just sewing on the collar. I was having a major issue with the bunching, and I was trying to figure out ways that I could solve it, but then I remembered my interest in historical fashion. If you look at bodices from the mid to late Victorian era, you'll notice that they're very heavily padded. These silhouettes were created by the padding which goes between the bodice and the lining. This is also still a very prevalent method within couture tailoring, so I decided to employ it here. I took strips of quilting batting, then ladder stitched them together under the chest. I also ended up using it for the epaulets and anywhere else that needed any padding. And thankfully, this solved my problem completely. Now it's time to talk about the closure. As you can see, I started with the zipper, which is sewn underneath. However, instead of putting my stitches closest to the teeth, I actually set them farthest from. This way, I could machine sew my seam tape, which I would then pull around the edges and whip stitch into place by hand. Finally, I would remove the stitches on the outside for the zipper, as the seam tape now held it into place. I did the same for the collar and then added the lining. I top stitched the lining into place with my seam tape. I also added the cuffs and top stitched the lining into them as well. I had a goal with this cosplay to have a completely clean inside. As you know, there's a lot of padding and stitching going on the inside, so when I wanted to put the lining in, I wanted to look as clean as possible. Now it was just to add the finishing touches. I added the pockets in, as you can see. And I also wanted to state that the epaulets actually button closed, so that way when I add the leather strap that goes underneath it, it buttons into place. Finally, I took some red leather cord, braided it, and sewed it together to create the little string you see underneath. The first thing I started on the robe with was the embroidery. I create my embroidery templates using transfer paper. I scale the size of my image in IBIS paint and then print it out onto a full-size piece of paper. Once my template is printed, I iron it onto some cotton fabric. Once all that is complete, it's time to start embroidering. I used a satin stitch for the entire patch. Both patches took 14 hours to complete. Now it's time to create the capelet itself. I'll leave a link down below to a tutorial I followed. It's a super easy way to create a nice cape. I cut out my lining first and then traced it onto black velvet. The fabric is folded twice and I decide the length of my cape and then I make the necessary cutouts. Forgot to film this, but I also added the hood. As you can see, the cape has a wonderful flow to it. Now I'm just creating the small slits in the front and the back. Next, I'm just marking where to hem it. Now to add the gold trim. I marked it about 2 inches up from where I want my hem, then sewed it down on both sides using my sewing machine. The very last thing I added on this cosplay was my lining, so that way it would be completely seamless from the inside. I marked where I wanted my patch and then put it into my embroidery hoop. I had covered the back of my patch in Mod Podge that way it wouldn't unravel. Finally, I sewed it on and trimmed off the excess. Now this is where things got a little bit tricky. At this point I had attached my lining, however it was bubbling significantly, so I pinned it into place and put a piece of fabric over my velvet, and proceeded to carefully iron it. Finally I top stitched it down. Now for Gordon's hat. I used this hat and of course Tanya's hat for reference. First, I created a circle using wire. I used a circular pot to get it nice and exact. Next, to keep the wire from snagging, I covered it in this faux leather. I cut it to size, then stitched it around by hand. Now to create my pattern. I covered the various parts of my reference hat and painter's tape to create a pattern. Now I'm transferring it to my fashion fabric. I made sure to add seam allowance so all the pieces could be sewn together. Now I'm just taking the pattern for the other pieces. Once that was all sewn together, it looked like this. I put this expandable tubing which came from my original hat to help keep the shape. Next, I attached this to an EVA foam base. I also made sure to cover this in my fashion fabric before adding the brim. The brim was created out of this leather. These were originally spats for horse riding that I had somehow found at a thrift shop. Once I had the shape I wanted, I traced it around my base hat. I put everything together with contact cement, now it was just to add the finishing touches. I started off with a faux leather band around the hat, and then I took some of the excess leather to create other details. I used rivets to attach the decorative piece on the front, and finally I glued on my embroidered patch. First, I cut my leather strips to the proper length using a belt as reference. Next, I create a belt loop. Now I'm punching holes for the stitching to go through. After my belt loop was stitched, it was time to prepare the leather for stamping. I wet the edges of the leather and then rounded them out. Next, I'm taking this vaguely clover-shaped stamp and wetting the leather and hammering it into place. I added a stem to make it a proper clover. I measured the distance between the clovers, and I stamped them on the edges of the belt. Here is the belt all stamped and ready for dyeing. I did the same with the over-the-shoulder strap. For now, the belt buckles are simply looped for decoration. Do not attach them until you are done dyeing. With everything prepped, I began dyeing my belts. Once that was dry, I added a tan coat finish. This helps seal the dye into place to prevent bleeding and gives the belt an overall sheen. Now to create Gordon's grimoire case. I start with the same leather that I used for the brim of the hat and trace out my shapes. Once I had cut out all my shapes, I took my red pleather and used it as a lining. I traced all the shapes onto the pleather, and then I glued it together using a spray glue. Constructing the bag was definitely a bit more of a challenge. I tried to punch the holes in the leather and then stitch it like I did the other pieces of the belt, however the leather was just too thick, so I had to take my awl, punch the hole, and then stitch it by hand. I also ended up taking a sheepskin remnant and wrapping it around the bag to add more of a decorative touch. I attached all the leather pieces with rivets, and the bag slides through the belt.